And welcome back to the Nutrimedical Report. We have a number of extremely earth-shattering events and issues to talk about with Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Foundation. The websites are LaRouche, LaRouchePAC.com, and for the Executive Intelligence Review, LaRouchePUB.com. Harley, you sent me the links today, and I have the articles up. Let's go over these issues, because the G7, we commented on the show yesterday, and things are beyond nuts. I mean, some of the comments that I hear coming out are so bizarre, it defies logic. From Angela Merkel, from Barack Obama, and from Mr. Harper from Canada. And the kind of comments are actually what I call the rhetoric that can lead to war.
Well, it's actually very advanced in terms of what we see as a kind of degeneration from the previous conferences. I mean, first of all, there's something very interesting. Here you have Harper making these insisting that Putin be expelled and Russia be expelled until Putin is out of office. Now, there was an Irishman who wrote in the Irish Times a story about, does the G7 still represent anything? And he pointed out that Russia, India, and China have larger economies by far than Canada and Italy. And they raised the question, Canada's economy is smaller than Indonesia and Mexico, so how come they're still in the G7? Except because of the British connection, the Commonwealth. So you have on the one side this institution that was originally set up by Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing when they were Chancellor of Germany and President of France. So that's in the late 70s, early 80s. Now Schmidt, who's now 96 years old, issued a statement this week attacking Merkel, the current German Chancellor, saying that it's an absolute mistake to not talk to the Russians and that the Russians are a natural partner for Europe. They should be at the conference. Now, at the same time, another German chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, who was chancellor until Merkel got in, said he agrees with Schmidt. And then, very interestingly, the current foreign minister of Germany, who's from the same party as Schmidt and Schroeder, which is the Social Democrats, and they're in a coalition government with the Christian Democrats now. Steinmeier, as the foreign minister in the government, also criticized Merkel. So Merkel's come under very strong attack from her coalition partner, as well as throughout Europe, for siding with Obama to exclude Russia. Now, secondly, there's a parliamentary commission of inquiry into the cooperation of the BND, the German intelligence unit, the equivalent of the FBI. I wouldn't call it collaboration with the NSA, their subordination to the NSA, where they were deployed by the National Security Agency to put wiretaps and metadata collection on all major German industries and make that available to the National Security Agency so the NSA could find out which German companies were doing business with Russia and China and any other country. And Merkel supposedly agreed to that. Thomas de Maizière, who's her defense minister, was in charge of the BND at the time, or the oversight of the BND, and he's acknowledged that he was aware this was going on. So you have a very serious challenge to Merkel, which is good because the third thing her government is doing is supporting the insistence of the European Union that the Greek government continue the policy of killing Greeks in order to pay the debt to the European banks. So that's, in my book, that's 3 strikes and she's out. And Merkel is in big trouble right now, which is good because she's one of the few people who is totally tied to Obama.
Yeah, she really is, isn't she?
You know, her other comment at the G7, which Obama seconded, is the decarbonization of the world by 2030. Now, how you do that, what are you going to do, take it out of the Mendeleev table of elements? You know, eliminate,
well,
you want to eliminate carbon, we're a carbon life form.
Well, the danger is a thing called a carbon oxygen cycle. And if you remove carbon or you capture it, plants and the benthic layer of the oceans, which makes 80% of the oxygen and the rainforest, they die. And if they die, basically, we have no oxygen. We also have no ozone layer.
We die.
So we die, and also it kills all the living plants in the oceans because the ultraviolet light requires three things: ultraviolet light, a magnetosphere, and oxygen. The oxygen's falling worldwide because of policies. 50% of the rainforest has been cut down in the last 50 years, and we have giant dead zones in the ocean where basically there's no oxygen. A great part of even the Gulf of Mexico is dead now because of the use of Corexit 9500 and the release of hydrocarbons into the biosphere there. So what's going on worldwide is a crazy policy that will actually collapse the biosphere and kill every living thing on Earth unless you're living in a domed city.
Well, and this is what's being discussed at the so-called summit of the world's leading powers. How to exclude Russia to the point of launching a war against them, which would be a war of annihilation. How to destroy life on the planet with a decarbonization policy. And, on top of that, Obama today is announcing his brilliant strategy to fight ISIS. And, what does it involve? It involves sending more U.S. advisors. So we're going to now have over 3,000, maybe 3,500 Americans in Iraq with no real sense of mission. And I'll add one more thing. Very interesting. I saw today there was an article in the Daily Beast, which I guess used to be Newsweek or Time, I guess Newsweek, which identified for the first time in a major U.S. publication in depth that we're training neo-Nazis in the National Guard in Ukraine. That is, people who pronounce their allegiance to Hitler and the Nazis are in the Azov Brigade, which is the leading edge of the Ukrainian army. And it's being trained now by American Marines to fight against the pro-independence forces in eastern Ukraine. So what more can you say? We're supporting Nazis, we're supporting jihadists. That's the Obama policy. So as bad as Merkel is, Obama's worse, and he's got to go.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what I see happening is literally, I watched a video clip that somebody sent me it showed an Egyptian news out of Cairo, and had former generals and major news broadcast analysts. And these people obviously had a clue. And one general there, he was enraged, banging his desk at why Americans were putting up with Obama. And why are you doing this? Why? And then translated into English was his statement. You can see the emotion there. I would like to see Americans have that kind of emotion. I can't believe, and it makes me choke, I can't believe Americans are putting up with this in both parties. The Democrats got to understand what Obama is doing is destroying America, but he's also destroying the Democratic Party. And the same goes with Hillary Clinton. She was one, basically, she's going to be, if we want to call it, Obama continued the policy of George Bush, but Hillary Clinton will amp it up considerably. And people need to understand that we also have a bunch of candidates in the Republican Party that are not much better. They all basically are walking lockstep, and they want the other side to take up and do the same evil things they want to, just like Obamacare was a Republican idea in the first place. A bad idea, and it's going to go up 40% in terms of cost, so it's not really going to save people money. It's completely insane. But our foreign policies, excluding the Russians, this is a guarantee that at some future point, Russia and China will be at war with us. That's coming. Physical war.
Well, and that is coming quicker than most people know. In the next segment, we should talk about the fight that's going on between the Obama administration and the Russians over the question of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, right, which the U.S. has now accused the Russians of violating, and the Russians say, please give us the evidence of that. And, of course, there's no evidence.
Right. Well, the problem is, you see, what we're doing is we're deploying what's called a first strike launch weapon system in Europe, which means if they detect launch, they're going to fire directly on advancing nuclear missiles coming out of their silos in Russia. And Russia sees this as a first strike weapon system. That's what they see, because they know that if we hit their missiles in launch phase, it means they can strike all their cities and they have no defense. That's what they see it as. Come back, and Harley, I don't want to start pulling my hair out because I would have pulled it out a long time ago, considering how crazy this is. The comments by Harper, by the way, Harper in Canada is getting lots of criticism internally. Angela Merkel's being pulled apart by her own people and so-called allies in Germany. Obama here is being abandoned by the Democratic Party, and to be honest with you, he's like dangerous. But the problem is that Hillary Clinton is getting a pass by the media on policies that are even more aggressive and more crazy than even Obama. And we have a number of Republican candidates that, to be honest with you, are shadows of what Obama could be, but they'll just have a Republican stamp on it. It's very disturbing. There's only a few candidates. One of them is Rand Paul, that I consider the top one, that has a rational policy and foreign ability where you basically operate from strength, but you negotiate. You wouldn't cut off the red line phone. I mean, a miscalculation from a passing comet or an asteroid could precipitate a full thermonuclear exchange. For example, the comet that passed and hit over the southern Russia just a couple of years ago could have easily started off a nuclear exchange because of explosions in the high atmosphere of an incoming orbital object. I mean, coming in from deep space. So I don't think people understand how stupid this is, what Obama's done. And the comments he's made, he looks like an insane Mickey Mouse there. I think he's even lost more weight, and his ears look even bigger. It's bizarre. I mean, it's like Bizarro World. You look and you see, oh my gosh, these are the people that are running our world? How crazy is this?
Well, I think this is where the American people have been very poorly served by the so-called media, which, of course, is run by the same corporations that run Obama.
Right.
But I think there's also enough information out there. I mean, I was just involved in a debate with someone over this Daily Beast article, which says that the U.S. government is arming and training neo-Nazi units of the Ukraine military. And this person responded to me saying, oh, there's another one of your anti-Obama rants. And I said, this is not an anti-Obama rant. I'm presenting a report which has on-the-scene evidence from a reporter that when they were deployed with the Azov Brigade as part of being embedded in the American military trainers, they saw people with tattoos that were swastikas. They talked to young people who pledged allegiance to ethnic cleansing in eastern Ukraine, in other words, getting rid of the Russian-speaking people who live there. And, I said, this is not an Obama rant. Why won't you deal with the reality that your president is putting the United States in an alliance with Nazis and al-Qaeda terrorists? And she wrote back and said, there you go, ranting again. So, there are people who, many of whom still support President Obama, who are pretty crazy on this. But then you have the flip side, the John McCain, Lindsey Graham neocons, who embrace the neo-Nazis because they're anti-Russian. And so instead of looking at the world from a higher strategic standpoint and defining U.S. interests as what will provide the best long-term security for the United States, they're willing to go to war against everybody. And this is where you see the split between the liberal imperialists who support Obama's regime change wars versus the McCain neocons who also support the regime change wars but say we're not doing enough. Now, where's the voice which says, why the hell are we fighting in these places? Why are we creating more anti-Americanism with our policies? And this is where, you have to give Rand Paul a little bit of credit because he said he doesn't want to be engaged in these fights. There are some Democrats who say the same thing, but they're minor voices in these political parties, which are essentially war parties. And so we, the American people, have to roll up our sleeves and get into the middle of this thing and bloody some noses. Make sure that Jeb Bush never becomes the Republican nominee, that Hillary does not become the Democratic nominee, that there's a real debate over what are the long-term strategic interests of the United States. And that's what LaRouche is saying has to be done.
Yeah, and the real danger here, and I think people should understand is, we have a number of people that obviously are possessed. I mean, that's the best medical term I can say. They're possessed. It defies logic. They want to fight a war that no one can win. It's called a Pyrrhic victory, the ancient term. A Pyrrhic victory is where you're the last man standing, you have a mortal wound, and you'll die in a day, but everybody else is dead on the battlefield and groaning, or soon will be dead. And the Pyrrhic victory, you're standing on the top of the hill, I am the victorious, and you're holding up your sword as you're bleeding to death. That's not really going to work. And I don't know if these people think they're going to hide in underground places they call hotels underground. But if a war gets started in Israel with Netanyahu or with Obama or Harper or Angela Merkel with Russia and China, or they don't have the red phone even so that the near space object might be misguided as basically a launch on command, we're going to have an exchange that's going to destroy everybody. And the problem is they also have weapons in space like geoengineering weapons and tectonic weapons, where they're not just going to be firing off nuclear weapons, they're going to release bioweapons, they're going to release superstorms, they're going to release massive superquakes and tsunamis like Cumbre Viejo and the Azores. To me, this is apocalyptic. And the G7 nations to exclude Russia, when Russia just wants to have a market economy, expand from just energy and oil-based, when China wants to have respect, where the BRICS nation currencies become part of the basket of world currencies not controlled exclusively by the European and London banks, they just want respect. Why can't we give them a part of the pie and some respect and have a stable world currency like the Bretton Woods system where there is a reasonable exchange rate, and we have a stable world economy not based on derivatives, and a stable world system where it's not where the war economy is the largest part of our economy now. That's ridiculous. It's something that just humanity will not survive this.
Well, and this is what the problem is when you deal with Americans in an upcoming presidential race. Now, the first thing that's really crazy is, I know you agree with me, why are we, we're 16 months before the election, and the election's in full swing? This is because there's so much money involved. You know, if people don't get their hands on the money now, they'll be left out. And so you've got this insane drive of people who have no business running for president, trying to find a billionaire or a few multimillionaires to fund their campaign. Now,
right.
You look at someone like Jindal or Walker or, there are a whole list of these guys who are complete incompetents. Rick Perry, Rick Perry says, I created jobs in Texas, I know what to do. He didn't create jobs in Texas. Fracking created jobs in Texas.
Yeah,
and now that when the oil price fell, those jobs left.
Well, here's the problem. The whole thing was misguided. They, just like in all different branches of the military, they didn't use Corexit 9500 that's narrow and cytotoxic and genotoxic. All the other branches of the military use another chemical for dispersing hydrocarbons. The same way as hydrofracking, they have web-based, it's web, or we call base type of, it doesn't use toxic chemicals, it doesn't deplete all the water. You got to recharge the aquifers. So they're not only poisoning it, and now, of course, with our war and the deals we're making with the Saudi Arabians, which are totally ticked off with us, we now have the price of oil so low that the so-called oil industry is gone. You can't make money at this dollar price of oil.
This is Dan Phillips. IRS money you can't pay.
Pretty insane, isn't it?
That's crippling you.
Yeah.
I've defended people from the
I mean, everything that I see happening is, it's like somebody on crack cocaine who's just getting high on the idea they're soon going to commit suicide.
Well, you want to see the insanity of this. Last night, I watched about an hour of television news just to get a sense of what they're reporting.
Right.
And most of the news coverage was about these two escaped convicts in New York on MSNBC. And
Harley, I honestly think I'm on the sidelines looking at this. I'm not eating popcorn or I'm just going, no. I mean, when I read the articles about the G7 comments, I'm thinking, my gosh, is this real? Am I in a nightmare? What the hell's going on here? These are the kind of comments that guarantee the end of your world.
In Europe, they're calling the meeting between Merkel and Obama that took place on the sidelines of the G7 the Biergarten Gipfel, the Beer Garden Summit. Now, The last time a Munich beer garden was famous was during Hitler's attempted putsch run from a beer garden in 1923. So there are some German commentators who are saying perhaps it was not the best choice of words to call it the Beer Garden Summit. Now, if Obama, who knows whether he was drinking beer or not, I think he's just drinking the elixir of his own sense of importance and invulnerability. But the other issue that should be on the front page of the newspaper is that the State Department stated that the Russians are violating the intermediate nuclear force agreements and that maybe we should end that treaty agreement. Now, the Russians are saying, what are you talking about? And the U.S. said, well, 2 years ago you fired a cruise missile. And the Russians said they already acknowledged that 2 years ago and that nothing has happened since then. Meanwhile, the U.S. is actually trying to break the treaty because we're about to deploy a new generation of tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe, even when the Western European countries are saying, not so fast, we're not so interested in that. Now, do Americans realize that President Obama, the peacenik, the guy the Republicans say is indecisive and not tough enough, he's planning on putting nuclear missiles in Western Europe at a point at which we are provoking the Russians against Western Europe? I mean, I can't imagine that John McCain could put two sentences together, but, obviously he doesn't see this.
I think he's actually... People have, as a proxy, put in for a name change, and his current name is not John McCain, it's John McInsane.
Well, it's absolutely valid, and you get Lindsey Graham, who just was promised millions of dollars by Ronald Perlman for his campaign. I don't know if people remember Ronald Perlman. He was one of Michael Milken's guys. They were called Milken's Monsters. And he's one of the guys who did all these leverage takeovers in the 80s, where he used a tiny insurance company to take over Revlon Corporation, put it hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, ended up firing about 20,000 employees, spinning them off. He made a fortune on it. Milken made a fortune on it. And the people of Revlon took a huge loss. He's a big supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the same Ronald Perlman is now the leading supporter of Lindsey Graham's campaign. And he said it's because Lindsey Graham is willing to risk everything to defend Israel. So this is what we're dealing with. Billionaires who are crazy, who want to keep a system going where they exploit submissive American workers, exploit cheap slave labor in poorer countries, and get the president and the Congress to promise them bailouts if they run into financial difficulty.
Right,
and to back it up by going to war against our nation's would-be allies.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's how crazy it is. It's not making things more secure or safe for Israel. In fact, I had a conversation last week with an anesthesiologist in Israel, and he's been listening to the program and analyzing it, and he says, I got to get out. My parents live in America. This place is going to go. I mean, if they start a war, anybody above ground in Israel is going to die. I mean, when the rockets start flying and the war with engaging with Russia and China get going, this is going to get beyond nuts. So, and the same
this
thing.
This is where you see a potential for a change, because
right.
there was a conference, what was called the BRICS Parliamentary Summit, that took place in Russia this last week, and what they talked about is the relationship of the BRICS with the G7 countries. And what they talked about was, wouldn't it be a better world if we could collaborate with them instead of be at loggerheads with them? And they made an interesting point. The 5 BRICS nations, as of the end of 2014, represented the 30% of the world's GDP from the figures for that year. And the G7 countries represented 37%. Now, the G7 countries include Japan, Germany, and the United States, which are the major countries that provide the total GDP. So 30% versus 37%. Now, but since in the last few years, the BRICS countries are growing at phenomenal rates, whereas we're seeing zero growth or a shrinkage of the transatlantic G7 nations. Now, what the parliamentarians said at this conference is, instead of competing, why aren't we working together with these rail projects, with these power projects, with the healthcare initiatives to build hospitals in Africa and in Asia? Why aren't we working together? Well, there's a simple reason. That as the GDP shrinks in the advanced sector countries, the transatlantic countries, they're looking for loot to protect their bloated debt. Where are they going to find it? I mean, there's not much more loot you can get out of Africa. There's not much more you can get out of Central America and South America, especially since the South Americans are in a rebellion now. The two greatest sources of loot would be Russia and China. And they were trying to get Russia and China to voluntarily give in to the superiority of the G7, and the Russians and the Chinese said, no, thank you. And so now they're trying to bluff them by threatening war against them. And this is a strategy that's, if they were successful, all it would mean is you'd have another year or two of a bloated financial system before it collapsed. But they're not going to be successful because Russia and China will not be bluffed. And that's why, as you were saying on the break, we face a danger that miscommunication could lead to thermonuclear confrontation and war.
Well, here's on the financial side. And I'm going to spray paint a couple of Jenga sticks, I call it. The first Jenga stick is the Greek stick. That stick right now is the Greeks are going to make a payment this week. I think around $320 billion. And
no, they're not. That actually has changed.
Right. What's it now going to be?
They were supposed to make one last Friday, and what they did is they took a provision that exists under the IMF agreement going back to the 60s, that they can lump all their payments due in June together. So instead of making a payment last Friday, which they could have made, but then that would have been $350 million. Instead, they now owe $1.7 billion by the end of the month. They might even be able to make that, but it's doubtful. But there's no way they can cover $12 billion that's due in July, which is owed to the European Union and the European Central Bank.
And by the way, that occurs at the same time in Jade Helm. Jade Helm, I've coined the term terror porn. This is a pornographic form of terror where they're actually, in the simulation of the Jade Helm, going to get patriots in the state of Texas. Now, if there's one state you don't want to start ticking off patriots, it's in Texas. And the state governor, even if he was even partially complicit, which he won't be, if this gets out of control, you could have civil war in Texas this July. And they're already talking about shutting down banks and doing all kinds of other parts of the, quote, simulation of literally, knock and grab kind of attacks on citizens in these various towns and places where they're going to do the Jade Helm test. And here's what I expect to happen. July, when Greek defaults, it's going to occur parallel to the fact that the Iranians are checking every ship going through the Strait of Hormuz, and when they finally close the strait by just calling the insurance carriers and say, we're not going to let these carriers come through from Saudi Arabia or the other Arab countries, Muslim countries that are bringing in oil, it's going to hit the fan. And I expect a major, what I call, I'm not going to say collapse, but I'm going to say worldwide correction. It'll be like a pulmonary embolus or a cardiorespiratory collapse to happen this fall. That's what I see coming. And welcome back, and Harley, a good thing I'm sitting down, because otherwise I'd fall down when I hear all this stuff. And I always think, while I'm doing research, like, I got a kick out of what I call the snipers. People that don't want to read, don't want to evaluate reality. They'll float along, even if their bank account gets emptied in 3 or 4 months' time by bailing in, and they think, oh no, what they did to Cyprus, that can't happen here. Well, guess what? The Federal Reserve, the Canadian government, the British government have all repeated that you're an unsecured creditor in these banks, and when the derivatives market collapses, because it's going to collapse, your money's gone. And imagine I called there's a song from Donald Fagen talking about Black Friday, and of course, maybe I should play the song in one of these clips. My grandfather was around in the 1920s when people were jumping out of 19th floor windows of hotel rooms, because they could actually open them back then. You couldn't open them now. Or jumping off the roofs of buildings because it was gone. All of a sudden they were millionaires, and then they basically couldn't buy a hamburger. People don't understand this is something that is in our near future unless we deal with and get rid of Obama and Harper in Canada and Angela Merkel and the craziness of these policies.
Let me give you an example of something that just happened an hour ago. The main headquarters of Deutsche Bank were raided by 200 federal police and financial security officers of the German government. This is in coordination with a tax fraud scheme investigation that's being taken place in Switzerland, Frankfurt, and apparently the Serious Fraud Office in the City of London. Now, my view is the Serious Fraud Office in the City of London is responsible for protecting those people who commit fraud. But in this case, Deutsche Bank is a criminal enterprise. It's been named now in 5 cases of criminal activity where they've gotten fines each time, but a deferred prosecutorial agreement, which is that they will not have to be tried, or the guilt of the case will not have to be determined as long as they pay the fine and don't do it again. Well, they've done it 4 more times. They haven't changed their behavior, and they keep getting a deferred prosecutorial agreement. Now, when are these guys going to be, the executives of these banks, going to be hauled into court and put in a perp suit?
Well, there's
Same thing with Hong Kong, Shanghai.
They basically get it. Right. What they do is they give them what I call a parking ticket, equivalent, even if it's in billions of dollars or millions, for behavior that gets them massive profits, and nobody goes to jail. They basically yawn whenever they get fined or whatever. Say, yawn, what do we got to pay? Oh, $5 billion, no problem. We can do that out of our walking around change. That's how bad this is.
This is where you see the criminality of the system, because you got someone like Timothy Geithner, who's now working for Warburg Pincus, one of the leading takeover firms. You get Bernanke, who's a consultant with some of these companies. You get others going into Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, the takeover firm. You have Kinder Morgan, which is the successor to Enron, which is one of the largest pipeline companies now benefiting from the fracking. And what you have is a revolving door of criminals where they're allowed to go into government and then out of government, into lobbying, into hedge funds, and so on. And then they're served by people like Eric Holder, Loretta Lynch, the former and current U.S. Attorney General. They're protected by the destruction of the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's an interesting letter I saw this week. Elizabeth Warren wrote an open letter to Mary Jo White, who's the SEC chairman. And I didn't realize this, but Warren pointed out that both she and her husband worked for law firms that defended Wall Street criminals. So wow. She's now in charge of the SEC, and Elizabeth Warren said, why aren't you prosecuting any of these firms? Could it be because of you and your husband's past connections? So, the answer obviously is, of course. They were made millionaires by these connections. So until we end this criminality, and the criminality at the top is Barack Obama, and in his case, he has such a big ego, you don't have to buy him or bribe him. All you have to do is praise him, and he'll do whatever the hell he's told to do. And that's what he's been doing, and that's what's so dangerous. And the gutlessness of the Republican Party is on display right now when Obama is continuing to send more troops into the Middle East. There's been no authorization to use military force. He's trying to get around it by saying, well, we're not engaged in offensive military actions. But the fact is we now are going to have between 3,000 and 3,500 troops there.
Well, the thing is they're collaborating on both sides. We know that they actually drop equipment material inside territory that's controlled by ISIS and ISIL. We had a former U.S. military general as an advisor in Fox News who was actually removed by Special Forces actions that killed some ISIL people because he was there as an advisor to help to advise them how to do operational command. And what's going on now is they're killing Christians and Muslims in these countries, and we're collaborating on both sides. We're allowing the Quds Force militia from Iran to be our allies there, along with the Iraqi former Republican Guard Shiites militia, and we're holding them back in areas north of Baghdad, within 75 miles of Baghdad, and going in and operationally dropping in supplies for the enemy. I mean, this is what's going on. People need to understand that Obama and the cabal behind him are complete criminals supporting ISIS that's slaughtering people on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's sending in advisors to train more Iraqi troops. And the bombing campaign is accomplishing nothing. In fact, they actually hold it back to make certain that more and more territory is consumed, not just there. The situation in Libya is thousands of people every day are trying to get across the Mediterranean Ocean.
Actually, there's another story. The latest story is the UN Security Council, or the UN organization, is calling for a rapprochement between the pro-jihadist government in Tripoli and the anti-terrorist government in Tobruk. The parliament is in Tobruk, and they just rejected the UN proposal that they patch up and make their peace with the other side. Now, that means Obama,
you gotta be kidding,
through Susan Rice, is telling those who want to fight against ISIS that they should form a coalition with ISIS.
Well, the same thing goes in Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We have Egyptian generals pounding the table on this news report I watched the other day, speaking in Egyptian, thinking how crazy it is that they're actually, the U.S. government under Obama is threatening to withdraw money and material and corporate support and even licensure for the M1 Abrams tanks and other things, because the Egyptian government, they're trying to blackmail them into kind of releasing from prison Muslim Brotherhood terrorists that are trying to rip the country apart. And of course, Israel
and then
Egypt
human
is
rights organizations are attacking the Egyptian government for defending the population from the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists.
Exactly, and the fact is that we're on the verge of a civil war inside Egypt caused by American policy. American policy could precipitate a civil war in Egypt, a population over 110 million. It's a big country. And a lot of military in Egypt. People don't understand, if Egypt goes rogue because of this or falls to ISIS and ISIL, the entire area is in extreme danger, because the best ally that Egypt has is Israel. And if that alliance breaks, Israel will go to the Samson option, and every Muslim town and city and population center within 10,000 miles will be nuked by Israel. They will.
Well, when we talk about people who have to go, I think besides Merkel, Obama, and Harper, we should include Netanyahu.
Well,
and
yeah,
the
he's
Saudi
crazy.
royal
The thing
family.
the Netanyahu is like, why is this mine on a day pass? He's actually proposing something that will wipe out the very nation of Israel. And I have Barry Chamish on next week. I talked to my friend Ron Klatz, who's Jewish, just the other night, head of the Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. And I said, look, I say on the show, I talked to an anesthesiologist last week. They know that the policies of Netanyahu and Lieberman are going to end the state of Israel. They'll die in a hail of missiles coming in, and Iron Dome and Green Pine radar system won't protect them. And the fact they have tons of nukes, so what? It means you're going to kill all your enemies, but you'll also be very, very dead.
Well, we can't fight a nuclear war. We've got to get rid of the people who want to do that, and that means Obama.
Yeah. The man is possessed, insane, and satanically riddled like a bad apple. Man, he's a Mickey Mouse on crack cocaine. How's that?
Well, maybe he'll be gone by next week. Let's see.
Well, if they don't impeach him, God help us. America is doomed.
Talk to you next week, Bill.
Absolutely. Amazing show today, Harley. I've got all the links up for those articles. People better read them.